At dawn, on a riverbank in northern Gaul, a Roman commander ordered his men to do something that, by every rule of warfare in the ancient world, should have gotten them all killed. He told them to stop fighting the enemy and start digging. Thousands of soldiers laid down their swords, picked up shovels, and began moving earth while a hostile army watched from across the water. To the tribesmen on the far bank, it looked like madness. It looked like surrender by exhaustion. What it actually was a death sentence for them. That commander was Julius Caesar in the year 58 before the Common Era, and the men with shovels were about to bridge the Rhine in 10 days and walk into territory no Roman army had ever entered. The enemy never imagined an army could carry its own bridge. They were wrong, and being wrong cost them everything. This is the thing almost nobody understands about Rome. The legions did not conquer the Mediterranean world because they were braver than everyone else, or stronger, or because they had better steel. Half the time, the tactics they used looked completely insane to the people watching. Forming a tortoise out of human bodies and shields, building a second wall facing the wrong direction, marching directly into a trap on purpose, surrendering ground they had bled for, only to take it back an hour later. Every one of these moves, in isolation, looks like a blunder. And every one of them worked, not by luck, but because terrain, discipline, and timing turned the absurd into the inevitable. So, here is what I want to walk you through over the next 25 minutes. 5 Roman tactics that should never have worked, and the precise reason each one did. First, the testudo, the tortoise formation, where Roman soldiers locked their shields into a moving box and walked, slowly, into a storm of arrows that should have shredded them. I am going to show you the exact geometry that made it nearly unbreakable, and the one mistake that turned it into a slaughterhouse. Second, Caesar at Alesia, where a Roman army of roughly 60,000 men chose to surround a fortified town defended by 80,000. And then, instead of running when a relief army of 250,000 Gauls arrived behind them, they built a second wall and dared the entire Gallic nation to break through. You will understand why digging 2 walls saved a Roman army that, on paper, was already dead. Third, the feigned retreat, the tactic where the most disciplined infantry on earth deliberately turned and ran, an act that breaks armies, and somehow used it to destroy the enemies who chased them. Fourth, the bridge over the Rhine, 10 days of engineering as psychological warfare, where the real weapon was never the structure itself. And fifth, the move that defined the whole empire, the road. Not a tactic you see on a battlefield at all, and the single most devastating thing Rome ever built. The reason a rebellion 800 miles away was already lost the moment it started. And along the way, I will tell you about the one Roman tactic that worked perfectly for 200 years, until the day it didn't, and an entire legion vanished into a German forest because of it. I spent most of my time reading the accounts these battles left behind. Caesar's own commentaries on the Gallic War, Polybius describing the legion's mechanics like an engineer describing a machine, Tacitus writing decades later about the disasters Rome preferred to forget. What strikes me every time is how often the surviving record describes a Roman decision that the writer himself clearly found bizarre. These were not reckless men. They were the most methodical military culture the ancient world ever produced. So when they did something that looked insane, it usually means we are missing the reason. My job here is to find the reason. Let me start with the tortoise, because it is the one most people have seen and almost nobody understands. Picture the assault on a walled city somewhere in the eastern provinces, late in the 1st century. On the walls stand archers and slingers, men who have spent their lives putting an arrow through a target at 200 paces. Below them, the ground is open, Anyone crossing it is a target. The defenders are not worried. They have done this before. They watch the Roman line and wait for the foolish charge that always comes. The one where attackers sprint across the killing ground and die in the open. But the Romans do not sprint. They walk. And as they walk, something happens to their formation that the defenders have never seen. The front rank brings their shields together, edge to edge, into a solid wall. The ranks behind them lift their shields flat over their heads, overlapping each layer like roof tiles, until the entire block of men disappears under a single continuous shell of wood and iron and leather. The sides close, the corners seal. What was a crowd of soldiers is now a single object, low and armored, creeping forward across the open ground. The archers loose. Hundreds of arrows arc up and come down, and they strike wood, leather, the hardened surface of overlapping shields. The Roman scutum was not a flat board. It was a curved, layered shield, strips of wood glued in alternating directions like plywood, faced with leather and rimmed with iron, built specifically to absorb impact without splitting. Stacked into the testudo, those shields formed a surface that arrows could not punch through and could barely find a gap in. The defenders empty their quivers into a thing that simply keeps coming. Here is the geometry that made it work, and it is more clever than it looks. The strength of the testudo was never just the shields. It was the spacing. Every man stood close enough that his shield overlapped his neighbor's, which meant no single soldier carried the full weight of a strike alone. The force spread across the whole structure. And the men inside were not passive. They braced. They kept the formation rigid through constant pressure, every shield pushing against the next, so that an arrow or a thrown stone hit a surface that was effectively one solid plate. The discipline required for this is almost impossible to overstate. To form a testudo, hundreds of men have to move as one body, in step, while being shot at, trusting completely that the man beside them will not break and open a hole. Open one gap and arrows pour in. And that is the catch, the one mistake that turned the tortoise into a death trap. The testudo was built to defeat arrows and stones falling from a distance. It was slow and it was nearly blind. The men inside could see almost nothing. And against an enemy who refused to play the role of the archer on the wall, who instead charged the formation directly, or rolled heavy stones and burning logs into it, or simply waited for the ground to do the work, the tortoise became a cage. We have an account of a testudo advancing across what the defenders had prepared as soft, uneven ground. The formation needed flat footing to stay sealed. On broken terrain, men stumbled, shields tilted, gaps opened, and the structure that was invincible against arrows came apart from below. The defenders had not beaten the shields. They had beaten the assumption underneath them. So the testudo worked brilliantly, but only when the terrain was flat and the enemy obliged by shooting from a distance. Change either one, and the genius became a grave. Remember that, because it is the thread running through every tactic in this video. None of these moves worked on their own. Each one was a bet that the ground and the enemy would behave a certain way. Rome won when the bet was right. Which brings me to the most audacious bet Caesar ever made, and to the wall he built facing the wrong way. In the year 52 before the Common Era, the Gallic tribes finally united under a single chieftain named Vercingetorix. For years, Caesar had picked the tribes apart one by one. Now they had a leader smart enough to refuse open battle, to burn his own villages so the Romans could not feed off them, and to pull his army back into a fortress town called Alesia, perched on a high plateau with steep slopes on every side. Vercingetorix had perhaps 80,000 fighting men inside. Caesar had around 60,000. The Gallic chieftain's logic was sound. Let the Romans sit in the open, exposed, while a relief army gathered from every corner of Gaul to crush them from behind. Time was on the Gauls' side. Caesar could not take that fortress by storm without losing his entire force on those slopes. So Caesar did not storm it. He decided to build a wall around the entire town. Not a barricade, a complete ring of fortification, 11 miles of it, encircling the plateau so that nothing could get in and no one could get out. Ditches, ramparts, towers every 80 feet, walls of sharpened stakes. He would not fight Vercingetorix. He would seal him in and starve him. This is already an enormous gamble. 60,000 men deep in hostile territory, choosing to dig in around an enemy stronghold rather than retreat to safety. But here is where it becomes, by any sane measure, insane. While Caesar's men were building that inner wall, the relief army Vercingetorix had been waiting for began to arrive. The ancient sources put it at 250,000 men, and even if that number is inflated, every account agrees it was vast, larger than Caesar's army many times over, gathering on the open plain behind him. Now Caesar was the one trapped. An enemy fortress in front, full of warriors. A relief army behind, larger than anything he could field. Any commander in history would have done one of two things: lift the siege and run, or turn and fight the relief force before it organized. Caesar did neither. He ordered his men to build a second wall. A second complete ring of fortifications, 14 miles around, facing outward, away from the town, so that his army stood between two walls. The inner wall holding Vercingetorix in, the outer wall holding the relief army out, with the legions occupying the corridor in between. He had, deliberately, surrounded himself. Think about what that decision actually means. He was telling 60,000 soldiers, "We are now defending a ring 14 miles long against a force 4 times our size, while simultaneously containing 80,000 starving warriors at our backs, and we have no escape. There is no retreat. The walls we are building are the only thing standing between us and annihilation from both directions at once." Why would that work? Why is that not simply the most efficient way ever devised to get an army killed? Because of what fortification does to numbers. On open ground, 250,000 men can envelop 60,000 and crush them by sheer mass. But a wall changes the math completely. A wall means the enemy can only attack at the points where the wall is, and only as many men as can physically reach the wall at once can fight at all. The other 200,000 stand behind the front, useless, waiting their turn. Caesar's outer fortifications were studded with hidden traps in the ground before them, sharpened stakes in pits, iron hooks, rows of obstacles that broke up any charge and funneled attackers into kill zones his archers and artillery had already ranged. The relief army's overwhelming numbers became almost irrelevant. They could only hit the wall a few thousand at a time, and every few thousand who reached it died in front of it. The fighting at Alesia was as desperate as anything in Roman history. The relief army found a weak point on high ground where the fortifications could not be made complete, and they hammered it. Vercingetorix sortied from inside, trying to break out and link up. For a few hours, Caesar's double wall was being assaulted from both sides at exactly the same time. The nightmare scenario the whole structure was designed to survive. And it held. Caesar himself, in a famous red cloak so his men could see him, rode to the breaking point with his last reserves and counterattacked. The relief army, unable to bring its numbers to bear, unable to break through, finally broke and scattered. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix surrendered the next day. 60,000 Romans had defeated something close to 1/3 Gauls by trapping themselves on purpose. The second wall, the one facing the wrong way, the one that looked like a commander sealing his own tomb, was the entire reason they lived. It turned a hopeless, open-field disadvantage into a siege. And at a siege, the wall does not care how many men are on the other side. It only cares how many can reach it. That is the pattern again. An absurd move, surrounding yourself, that becomes brilliant the instant you understand what the terrain and the fortification do to raw numbers. Hold on to Alesia, because the lesson there reaches all the way to the last tactic I want to show you. But first, an even stranger one. The tactic where Rome's greatest strength, discipline that never broke, was used by pretending to break. The feigned retreat is one of the oldest tricks in war, and it is also one of the hardest to pull off, because it asks soldiers to do the single most dangerous thing on a battlefield: to turn their backs and run. Understand why that is so dangerous. Ancient battles were rarely decided by the killing in the clash itself. The lines met, pushed, stabbed, and most men on both sides survived that. The slaughter came afterward, in the rout, the moment one side's nerve failed and they turned to flee. A man running shows his unguarded back. A man running is no longer fighting, only escaping. And the side that holds chases the side that runs and cuts them down from behind by the thousands. Almost every lopsided ancient body count comes from the pursuit, not the battle. So to ask trained men to turn and run on purpose, in good order, while an enemy surges after them smelling victory, and then to expect those same men to stop, turn around and fight again, is to ask them to walk to the very edge of the thing that destroys armies. And then walk back. Only the most disciplined troops on earth could do it. The Roman legion, with its rigid command structure, its standards that every man kept his eyes on, its officers embedded at every level, could do it. Here is how the trap closes. A Roman force engages, fights for a while, and then the front line begins to give ground. Slowly at first, then breaking into what looks like a panicked flight. To the enemy, this is the decisive moment. The Romans are cracking. So they push harder, the disciplined enemy formation loosening as eager men surge forward to join the kill. Their line, which had been solid, stretches and ragged. They abandon their own high ground. They abandon their flank protection. They become a mob chasing a fleeing enemy across ground the Romans chose. And then the standards stop. On a signal, the fleeing Romans halt, reform, because they were never truly broken, only moving, and turn. At the same instant, troops the Romans had positioned in advance, held in reserve, hidden behind a rise or waiting on the flanks, strike the disorganized pursuers from the side. The enemy, now strung out entangled, with their own formation destroyed by the chase, suddenly faces a solid Roman line in front and fresh attackers on the flank. The hunters are surrounded. And the rout the Romans faked becomes the rout the enemy actually suffers. The genius of it is that it weaponizes the enemy's own confidence. The more sure they are that they are winning, the deeper they chase, the more completely their formation comes apart, the worse their destruction when the trap shuts. The feigned retreat does not beat the enemy's strength. It uses the enemy's strength against itself. But, and this is the part the legends leave out, it is the most fragile tactic in the entire Roman arsenal. Because a feigned retreat and a real one look exactly the same right up until the moment the line turns around. If even part of the formation panics for real, if the running becomes genuine fear instead of controlled withdrawal, there is no signal that can stop it. The trap collapses into an actual rout, and the army that tried to be clever simply dies the ordinary way. This is why it was reserved for veteran troops under commanders they trusted absolutely. Hand this tactic to nervous recruits, and you have not laid a trap. You have given the order that ends your army. The line between the most brilliant maneuver on the field and total catastrophe was a single man's nerve. Now let me take you back to that riverbank and the soldiers with shovels, because the bridge over the Rhine is the tactic where Rome's real weapon was never a weapon at all. It is the same year as the Rhine campaign, 58 before the Common Era, and the years just after. Germanic tribes across the Rhine had been raiding into Gaul and then slipping back across the river, confident that the water protected them. The Rhine was wide, fast, and deep. No army crossed it casually. The tribes treated it as a wall that Rome could not get past, and so they felt free to strike and retreat behind it whenever they liked. Caesar could have crossed in boats. It would have been faster and easier. He refused. He wrote later that it would not be fitting for the dignity of Rome, and beneath the dignity of himself, to cross in boats. What he meant, in plain terms, was this: anyone can paddle across a river. He wanted to do something that would terrify them. So his engineers built a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days. Understand what that involved. They drove massive timber piles into the bed of a deep, fast-flowing river, angled against the current so the water's own force locked them tighter, braced them together, laid a road across the top wide enough to march a column of men and pack animals, and protected it with pilings upstream to break up anything the tribes might float down to smash it. The whole structure rose out of the river in 10 days, built by soldiers who, between battles, were also some of the finest field engineers the world had ever seen. The legion did not just fight, it built. Every Roman soldier carried tools, knew how to dig, knew how to construct, and the army moved with the collective skill of a mobile construction corps. Here is the part that matters. The bridge was almost beside the point. What the bridge said was the weapon. The tribes across the Rhine had organized their entire strategy around one belief: that the river was uncrossable by an army. That belief was their security. It was the thing that let them sleep at night. And in 10 days, the Romans erased it. Not by sneaking across in boats in the dark, but by building a permanent road over their river in plain sight. An unmistakable statement that said, "Your wall does not exist. We can come whenever we want, in full strength, with our cavalry and our supplies and our siege equipment, and there is nothing you can do about it." Caesar marched his legions across, spent 18 days on the far side burning villages and demonstrating that Roman power could reach into the German heartland at will. And then he marched back and tore the bridge down. He did not need to hold the territory. He had already won the only thing he came for. He had destroyed the idea that the tribes were safe. This is psychological warfare carried out with carpentry. The real target was never the German warriors. It was their confidence. The bridge proved that no obstacle, not a river, not a mountain, not distance itself, could keep Rome out if Rome decided to come. And an enemy who believes that no barrier will protect him is an enemy who is already half beaten before a single sword is drawn. Which leads, finally, to the most devastating Roman tactic of them all. And it is not a battlefield tactic at all. It is the road. We tend to think of Roman roads as infrastructure, trade routes, engineering achievements you visit on holiday. But the road was a weapon, and arguably the most important weapon Rome ever deployed, because it solved the problem that defeats every empire: distance. Here is the problem every large state faces. The bigger you grow, the harder you are to defend, because trouble can break out anywhere and your army can only be in one place. A rebellion erupts in a distant province. By the time word reaches the capital, by the time an army is assembled and marched there over broken trails and through mud, weeks or months have passed, and the rebellion has grown into a war. Slow movement is the thing that kills empires. They simply cannot respond to crises fast enough across the territory they are trying to hold. Rome's answer was to build roads so straight, so solid, and so well engineered that a legion could march across them in any weather at a pace no enemy could match. These were not dirt tracks. They were layered constructions, a deep foundation of stone, gravel, and sand above it, a hard surface on top, crowned in the center and ditched at the sides, so rain drained off and the road stayed firm. Tens of thousands of miles of them, eventually, threaded across the entire empire, connecting every province directly back to the center and to one another. Now, run the same rebellion again. It breaks out in a distant province, but this time there is a paved military highway running straight to it. Word travels fast along that road, carried by a relay system of riders. A legion sets out and covers ground at a speed that would have been impossible on open country, moving in formation with its supplies in any season, day after day, without bogging down. The rebellion that should have had months to grow has instead a Roman army at its gates before it can organize. Remember Alesia, where the wall meant the enemy's numbers could not all reach the fight at once. The road did the same thing across an entire empire. It meant that no matter where the trouble was, Rome could concentrate force at that exact point faster than the trouble could spread. This is why I said a rebellion 800 miles from Rome was, in a sense, already lost the moment it started. Not because the rebels were weak, but because the road had already collapsed the distance that was their only real protection. Time and space are what a rebel needs. Time to gather strength, space to stay out of reach. The road took both away. It turned the entire empire into a single battlefield where Rome could always arrive first. No single Roman victory was as important as that. The testudo won assaults, Alesia won a war, the feigned retreat won battles, the Rhine bridge won a frontier, but the road won the empire and held it for centuries, by making sure the legions were never truly far from anywhere. The most devastating tactic Rome ever devised was simply the ability to show up. And now I owe you the story I promised at the start. The one Roman tactic that worked perfectly for 2 centuries, until the day it didn't. The legion's whole battlefield method depended on one thing above all else: space. The Romans fought in formation, in disciplined lines, with the standards visible, officers in their places, and shields locked. Everything I have described, the testudo, the feigned retreat, the controlled advance, required the legion to stay a coherent machine, every part connected to every other part. On open ground, that machine was nearly unbeatable. It is why the open field battle was, for 200 years, the place Rome most wanted to fight. In the year 9 of the Common Era, a Roman commander named Varus led 3 full legions, around 15 to 20,000 men, on the march through the forests of Germania. He trusted a local leader, a man named Arminius, who had served in the Roman army, spoke Latin, and was treated as a Roman ally. Arminius told Varus there was a small uprising that needed putting down, and he guided the column off the open routes and into the deep woods, the Teutoburg forest, a place of dense trees, narrow tracks, and ground turned to bog by rain. It was a trap. Arminius had secretly united the German tribes, and he had chosen ground that did to the legion exactly what broken terrain did to the testudo. In that forest, on those narrow, muddy paths, the Roman machine could not form. There was no open field to deploy into. The column was stretched for miles through the trees, in places only a few men wide, baggage and animals tangled in between. The standards could not anchor a line because there was no line. The very thing that made the legion lethal, its formation, was impossible to assemble. And from the cover of the trees, the Germans struck the strung-out column again and again over several days, never giving the Romans the open battle they needed. picking the helpless line apart piece by piece in the rain and the mud. 3 legions were destroyed, almost to the last man. Varus took his own life. The standards, the sacred eagles that anchored every formation, were lost. Rome never fully reclaimed the territory beyond the Rhine. The tactic that had won an empire on open ground had one fatal condition built into it. The same condition as the testudo. It needed the terrain to cooperate. Take away the open field, and the most disciplined army in the world became a column of men who could not bring their genius to bear. That is the truth running underneath every one of these tactics. The Romans were not magicians. The tortoise, the double wall, the false retreat, the bridge, the road. None of them were tricks that worked by themselves. Each one was a precise bet on terrain, on timing, and above all, on discipline. The willingness of ordinary men to do something that looked insane and trust that the reason behind it would hold. When the bet was right, the absurd became invincible. When the bet was wrong, the same brilliance became a forest full of dead legionaries. What I find remarkable is that the Romans understood this themselves. They did not win because they were fearless. They won because they were the most methodical, most engineering-minded, most disciplined military culture the ancient world produced. And that discipline let them attempt things no one else dared, because they could actually execute them. The shovel was as much a weapon as the sword. The wall facing the wrong way was as deadly as any charge. And the straight paved road was, in the end, the most lethal thing they ever built. If you found this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps the channel, and it tells me you want more of these tactical breakdowns. I have more battles waiting, and more moves that should never have worked. I will see you at the next one.